relevance to black political and cultural articulation, and also more broadly for thinking about transactional black politics, both backward in time but also forward in time, if we think in some linear or linear way. That the first moment, and I actually checked with my brother David yesterday to know that I'm not entirely off on this, that what I found interesting in some ways about last night's discussion and some of the sort of commentary over the course of the previous day is that the sort of tendency in some sense to equate the evolution and rise of racism with colonialism. And there's a certain discomfort I've had with that for two distinct reasons. One historical and the second at a sort of perceptual level. At the historical level, I think in many ways I would sort of push the date back, not simply for sort of a battle about chronology, but for the importance of the production of anxiety around race. And I would push that back to the period of reconquest, roughly between the 8th century and the 11th century, culminating, if we sort of fast forward, to the expulsion of Moors and Jews from Spain in 1492. Now, the reason why I suggest this, because in many, what's interesting, I think, is in many ways, the sort of the predicament of the Moor tends to drop out often in the sort of discussion of the process of racialization in Europe. Because in the case of the Moor, it's the instance where the sort of Moor moves from adherent of Islam to Moor to African to black or Moor to black, right? So the range of different moves that encounter both have implications for space, temporality, religiosity, the attachment of meaning to phenotype, right? So that we have, in this sense, the sort of marker of blackness, and then the marker for blackness is derogation, in some sense, emerging in this period, right? Now, when I last checked, the Portuguese, I think, landed at Ceuta somewhere around 1442. So therefore, in some sense, I think what I'm trying to suggest here is that we have to understand what were the sort of visual, ocular, religious, spatial, and temporal implications of that expulsion than for thinking about the evolution of racial slavery, and then ultimately the derogation of blackness throughout modernity and into late modernity. Now, point two sort of takes us into the slave trade. I think one of the implications for me theoretically for thinking about the slave trade in relation to black public sphere, and this is where I think in some ways some elements of sort of Marxian critical theory helps, specifically alpha theory, is that one of the things that I think Marx, and in some ways provides some linkage to thinking about in terms of black public spheres, the relationship between racial slavery and colonialism and the predicaments of racial slavery, colonialism, and then ultimately apartheid, is the fact that I think one of the things that racial slavery did was abolish the sort of distinctions between public spheres and private spheres, which would be successfully sustained as a fiction in bourgeois elements in the modern West, right? Now we sort of know from Alpha Serre's discussion in ideological state apparatus that in some sense, basically the public and private sphere distinction is basically bourgeois construction in and of itself. If we look at Habermas, and Habermas is in some sense sort of charting or detailed tracking of the emergence of the private sphere in bourgeois life, and in some sense there's sort of challenges in some sense that the public sphere then places on the bourgeois construction of the distinction between the public and private sphere. That we understand in some ways, and this is punctuated in some of the writings of Toni Morrison, which African descended peoples, many other minorities, many other non-whites have been under for much of the United States creation in some sense. So if you hear, for example, on a lot of black talk radio, in many ways, there's sort of heightened surveillance and anxieties about surveillance that you hear, for example, in a lot of the more general mass media. They're often scoffed at in black public media. They say, look, okay, now they're just going to experience what we've experienced for, say, a couple of centuries. So maybe now things will be shaken up a little bit. Okay? Now, so you think about that kind of lack of distinction, or sort of at least rupturing the notion of a distinction between public and private spheres. I want to move then to the third moment in terms of globalization that has, I think, some resonance in thinking about black public spheres. Is a relationship between mass media technology and the derogation of blackness. Now, I want to sort of point out that, and sort of make a general claim about technology in this sense, linking it to notions and discussions about surveillance, because it's with the technological innovation of, say, moving from Gutenberg, Gutenberg on the one hand, one end of the continuum, and the internet on the other, that these represent mass-mediated technologies that, in the sort of principles of capitalism, presumably were to revolutionize particular societies. Right? The same was said about the cotton gin. The same was said about a range of different technological innovations. However, limited access and the initial scarcity of these particular technologies meant that these technologies generally were initially only accessible to an elite and a select few, many within the military-industrial complex and many at elite levels. So we have, I think, in the sort of current moment, particularly with the use of the internet, in some ways, a sort of intensification of derogations of blackness. That is to say, the ability, for example, of many racist organizations to proliferate, disseminate, and seek to attract people to a range of different causes. And this is documented throughout in various parts of the world. One of the sorts of things which is interesting in terms of data on the European Union, that in addition, particularly after 9/11, in addition to sort of rise in anti-Arab sentiment, there's also been increased rise in anti-black racism. It's consistently across the EU. So how do we make sense of this, and particularly juxtaposing it against one of the sort of liberal presumptions that the sort of hyper-industrialization, increased technology, greater access to technology will in some sense make the world smaller and also tend to obliterate certain types of ethnic, racial, cultural, religious chauvinism. Right? It's clearly that we have to rethink this relationship to technology, and there are people like Adas and a whole range of people who have done this kind of work. So in that sense, I'm not really saying anything new. Now, this will sort of lead to point 4 in terms of globalization. Black public spheres themselves, right? Sort of alluded to this sort of public-private rupture, if you will, that led to the sort of formation of first abolitionist movements, the fact that most transnational black political actors generally operated at the interstices of communities, nation states, and as well as the international political economy. So there's a moment where in the Black Atlantic, Guru has a nice passage where he talks about the diaspora blacks having a contingent and partial relationship to the nation-state system. Right? So we can think about this sense in terms of a kind of non-predictability. Right? Now, this leads me to sort of part 4, point 4. What are some of the sort of implications of this? Given, I think, the sort of long-standing history of what I've characterized as a derogation of blackness, what are the kinds of possible political responses transnationally to the processes of derogation? I mean derogation, I'm not only referring at the symbolic level, but I'm also talking about practices of violence. I'm also talking about distinctive immigration edicts, laws, and the like, which affect a whole range of very, very distinct and disparate populations. So how do we make sense of this distinction and the disparate nature of black transnationalism on the one hand, at the same time the kind of recurrent features and themes of the sort of derogation of blackness in political responses? And this is where I want to sort of make the move to think about nationalism. Political responses which don't necessarily rely on the notion of kith and kin. Right? That is to say, how do black transnational political actors make certain types of political choices that don't rely on what we characterize in the academy as sort of essentializing discourses about race, racial identity, collective consciousness, and action. Right? Here's where I sort of think we get into some of the discussions last night about the relationship between nationalism and racism. And I think that I would add some modifications to Baba and Derrida's claims about the relationship between racism and nationalism. And I think it's important to provide a bit more historical specificity to, one, in a kind of almost typological way, discuss what forms of nationalism we're talking about when we talk about nationalism. Right? So that is to say, Finnish nationalism is not the same as Cuban nationalism, is not the same as French nationalism, is not the same as nationalism in Burkina Faso. Right? So if that's the case, and there's a variety of different forms of nationalism, can we make a blanket statement that racism is well, Derrida made the claim that racism is not nationalism, and that, I mean, that I concur with. I think Bolivar in his writings is a bit more ambivalent about the relationship by racism to racism and nationalism. But I think ultimately, even though he critiques Benedict Anderson, sees racism in some sense as epiphenomenal to nationalism, right? And I think that if we read, for example, even Gilroy's first book, Derogation of Blackness and the Union Jack, where he has a very detailed discussion of the ways in which British nationalism gets forged, not only as kind of, in the non-Foucauldian sense, a kind of discursive practice, but also institutionally and developmentally. It much more closely resembles, for example, David's work in The Racial State, where it becomes clear, at least to me, that racism becomes a constitutive element of a nationalist imaginary. Right? I think it's inconceivable, at least if we think about the context of the United States, to sort of think about racism as some sense being sort of outside of the nationalist project, right? And here I think that to sort of give two quick comments, from Fanon's essay, Racism and Culture. Racism is never a super-added element discovered by chance in the course of the investigation of the cultural data of a group. The social constellation, the cultural whole, are deeply modified by the existence of racism, right? And we can juxtapose that against some of Bolivar's writings, where at one point he says that racism is not an expression of nationalism, but a supplement of nationalism, or more precisely, a supplement internal to nationalism. Okay? Now, continuing this sort of response, so that even if we accept Derrida's idea that racism is not political, I think we can still, my response to that suggests that while racism may not be political, its enactment is predicated and indeed contingent upon certain types of politics, right? I mean, unless we want to reify racism and say it's this thing that people just somehow grab and put in someplace, then it seems to me it only comes to life through politics, right? So that not all forms of nationalism contain the specter of racism, to be sure. But I think if that's the case, we also have to consider the possibility that race and the idea of race may work differently for distinct groups and populations. So this is why I sort of made the mention of distinct forms of nationalism, right? And I think that in Derrida's comments specifically, that he made references to a sort of literature of antiquity, which I'm less familiar with, but it seems to me that most of his comments seem almost implicitly to rely on Renan's very famous series of lectures, What is a Nation, right? Where we have really the kind of first introduction in sort of Western European nationalist literature and discourse about nationalism, the relation or connection of nationalism to some notion of kith and kin, right? There's a very nuanced discussion of this in Keaton Malik's book, The Idea of Race, right? Now, what I'd like to suggest here, just to close, is that black nationalism and transnationalism doesn't necessarily have to fit into the Renanian paradigm, right, of kith and kin. And it may be in some ways, in response to Bolivar, that another type of nationalism, and I can point to more specific examples in the Q&A, that we can think about nationalism as a kind of way station to universalist practices, or putting it in the Bolivarian language, pushing the boundaries of or the limits of the possibility of conceiving humanity wholly and not just in part. So I'll end there.